Okay, in this teaching module, we're going to talk about Bretton Woods. The institutions created under Bretton Woods. So what is Bretton Woods? Why is it important? Okay, you have the classical liberal period of history, 1870 to 1914, which ends when England pulls out of the gold standard in 1914 to fight World War I. The U.S. creates the income tax and the central bank, and that was the end of the classical liberal period of history. Then you have World War I, the Great Depression, all the trade barriers put on during the nationalist period of the 1930s. Then it's seen by 1944 that the Allies are going to win World War II. So in 1944, John Maynard Keynes gets together the eventual winners of World War II and their finance ministers, Churchill, de Gaulle, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And they meet at Bretton Woods. Stalin walks out. So that was the beginning of the Cold War. And there was a separate one on creating free trade, and Roosevelt walked out of that. So we're stuck with the institutions of Bretton Woods as they've evolved over time. And so let's look at, there was 3 institutions created under Bretton Woods. And I should mention that if it's very good employment to work for the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, or the World Bank, because they pay very well and you're immune from local laws. You've got an immunity and you don't have to pay income taxes. So good work if you can get it. The institutions of Bretton Woods. So the idea, the proclaimed ideas behind Bretton Woods was to recreate the conditions which led to all the economic growth and capital accumulation under the classical liberal period. Those were the proclaimed goals of Bretton Woods. However, we're going to see that, in fact, it has done the exact opposite. Let's look at that. So the classical liberal institutions of early capitalism are free trade, the gold standard, which means that governments, because they have to exchange paper for gold and gold for paper, governments then have to balance their budgets. They can't run up debt and print money to pay for the debt. Then economic development at that time was considered economic growth based on capital accumulation and investment. So let's unpack that, as they say, and let's start with the International Monetary Fund. So in the 1930s, 1930s, buildup of nationalism, the nation state after World War I, and then the advent of Keynesian economics, or fiscal and monetary intervention. So the whole idea behind Bretton Woods, led by John Maynard Keynes, was to institutionalize Keynesian economics. And one of the tools to do that was the International Monetary Fund. So just like today, when certain special interests, banks, insurance companies, airlines, whatever, all the special interests who get bailed out by the central bank and the treasury departments under the International Monetary Fund, so that nations can practice fiscal and monetary expansionism. If a nation spends much more than it taxes, eventually people will stop buying the nation's bonds. And so what happens then, if that occurs, then the International Monetary Fund bails out nation states So instead of the gold standard, which required balanced budgets, the International Monetary Fund does the exact opposite and encourages states to run up debt because they'll be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund. So the first hypocrisy of Bretton Woods was that it did the exact opposite of the gold standard. Now let's look at the World Trade Organization. Again, classical liberal early capitalism was based on free trade. So the World Trade Organization was created to allegedly create free trade, but in fact, it's done the exact opposite. So Stalin walks out of the Bretton Woods, and at that point, you've got the Cold War, and suddenly the world is divided into the North, and these should be in quotes. These words, so in 1944, this consciousness, this social structure created by Bretton Woods has been with us ever since, to where now we visualize countries and peoples as either from the North and rich, developed world, or the South and poor, developing world. So that social structure consciousness has been with us ever since. And if you look at, so the North rich world has a comparative advantage in manufacturing goods. The South poor developing world, quote unquote, has a comparative advantage in agriculture goods. Now, the special interests in these countries have prevented free trade from occurring. For example, Europe, Japan, and the United States highly subsidize their agriculture industries and prevent free trade in agriculture goods. So there's no free trade in agriculture goods because the special interests in England or in Europe, United States, and Japan are preventing free trade in agriculture goods. So therefore, you're not getting the free trade that was promised, and hundreds of millions of sub-Saharan Africans can't grow out of subsistence poverty because there's not free trade in agriculture goods. Now, the North has the comparative advantage in manufacturing goods, but in the South developing poor, the ruling class, and this was witnessed by the Arab Spring, it's the ruling class who owns the means of production. And I saw this when I was in foreign service in Kazakhstan after the Cold War, where the Nazarbayev family owns most of the major manufacturers in Kazakhstan. And this is repeated, and again, the example of the Arab Spring, overthrowing the ruling families partially. So the special interests in the South developing poor world won't allow the importation of manufacturing goods. So you're getting the exact opposite of the free trade, which was ostensibly the reason for Bretton Woods and creating the World Trade Organization. Now we'll get to the World Bank. So the World Bank is an example of what's known as foreign aid. And there's a joke, I guess, that foreign aid takes from the poor people in rich countries and gives to the rich people in poor countries. That's what foreign aid does. And so the World Bank is financed by the nation states, by the taxpayers of the nation states. And so instead of economic growth based on capital accumulation, you have this thing called development economics. Which is a form of Keynesian economics where the state is seen as a paternalistic job provider or responsible for macroeconomic manipulation to create jobs. So that's called development economics, and that's the new economic development as opposed to the economic growth based on capital accumulation and investment of the early classical liberal period. So what the World Bank does is funds state-driven projects in the South. And so it's a transfers from the taxpayers in the North to the states of the South, quote unquote, the South. And again, this is starts during the Cold War. And I have a paper in this Journal of African Development, showing how during the Cold War, foreign aid was used to buy votes at the UN. And so you would get the Soviet or the Eastern Bloc or whatever it is, however you want to define it, and then the West funneling money to the South for votes at the United Nations. And my paper shows how during the Cold War, the levels of aid were much higher than after the Cold War. And during the period of high amounts of foreign aid, specifically in West Africa, I was a specialist on the West African Monetary Union and served in the Foreign Service in Dakar, Senegal, and worked all over the West African Monetary Union, French-speaking West Africa. And I show that for the French West African countries, that the higher levels of aid means less civil and political liberties. And there's been a recent research that shows through today that higher levels of foreign aid mean higher levels of corruption. So you're getting these status transfers, not economic growth based on capital accumulation and investment. So the proclaimed goals of Bretton Woods were demagogic hypocrisy, because the end result is they achieved the exact opposite of their proclaimed goals. And we're stuck with this social structure through today. Thank you. That completes our teaching module on Bretton Woods.